Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Drive Pink Dialogue, episode number 24. It's the midweek episode, and today we're going to be grading every move of the offseason just to give us a sense of where this roster is, why maybe we weren't in the right position to succeed over the last couple of weeks in Champions Cup, and where we might be going moving forward. But before all of that, as always, I'm your host, Scotty. I'm here with my co-host, Saur. How you feeling tonight, man?
Feeling good. A little bit disappointed in the fact that we're not going to have more midweek games since we're out of the CONCACAF. But hey, we're coming off a win, and I think this is the perfect time to record this podcast because the transfer window's closing, and yeah, time to take stock of the roster.
Definitely, I think time to take stock of the roster. For those that don't know, the transfer window closes April 24th. So that's in 1 week. April 23rd, I think. So in 1 week, it will already have been closed. There's still scuttlebutt about maybe adding one more player, and we'll talk about that here in a minute and maybe towards the end. But for now, it feels like the vast majority of this roster is set, at least until the summer, and we want to talk about it. But before we do, there's a few quick hitters that I think we should get to. Today, they had a training session. The guys had a training session, and there was an injury report update, some positive, some negative. First off, Jordi Alba, not at practice today. The injury that he suffered, it was a non-contact hamstring injury, which is always scary. He did walk off the field on his own power, but still not something you want to see. And then, of course, for him to miss practice 4 days later, not a great sign. We might be without Jordi Alba for a little bit.
It's a hamstring issue, isn't it?
Yeah, seemingly.
Big loss. He's obviously one of our best players on that side of the pitch. The only good thing and the only silver lining that I can see here is that Franco Negri is back. So we're not going to have to see Noah Allen in that position too much. Hopefully Franco Negri can stay fit, and it's not going to be a long time on the sidelines for Jordi Alba. So let's hope for the best.
Yes, there was a lot of more positive news, though, in individual training, doing some soft stuff, but being on the field with the guys was 3 players returning from injury: Leo Campana, Robert Taylor, guys that we haven't seen in the last couple games, and then Ian Frey, who we haven't seen since last summer, on his way back. 3 big additions, and these are the type of players, when they come back, you suddenly feel great about your roster and suddenly feel great about your depth. All of a sudden, every game, your bench looks dynamic and like you have game changers on there. 3 players on their way back. Probably not this weekend, but in the coming games.
Yeah, at the risk of biting my tongue on this, I haven't felt the absence of Leo Campana as much. Obviously, he hasn't been out for that long, but we've been scoring enough goals for me to not feel his absence as much. So always a positive to have him back.
Even in the Monterrey game when we needed goals and we had 0 subs the entire game and no tactical changes, you still didn't miss
Campana.
Campana.
Monterrey this season. What are you talking about? I don't remember.
You blanked that one out. Nice.
Yeah, I don't know what you're talking about. Robert Taylor is going to be a big one. I am very excited for him to come back. Thankfully, it wasn't a long injury like Redondo's. God knows we need him back. And then Ian Frey, that one could potentially be like a new signing. I know all Inter Miami fans are calling for a defensive signing before the transfer window closes, but if he can come back to his previous levels, that could potentially be like a big summer signing, having him back.
Yeah, I'm very excited about Ian Frey. He is so toolsy, and there's just so much potential there that if he could ever get healthy and stay healthy, he would be dynamite for us, assuming that it's still in there, and hopefully we get to see him soon. The only other note that has been going around over the last couple of days was that Matías Rojas appeared on the MLS website for Inter Miami for a day or so until people saw it, noticed it, took screenshots, and then they took him down. But that does seem to indicate that a Matías Rojas signing might be, on the doorstep. We will talk about him later in the episode, but it feels like that's something that could be happening in the next couple of days.
Yeah, it's been in the pipeline for a while. This is like a mini transfer saga for Inter Miami. Hopefully it comes through quickly and before Robert Taylor gets back, because it'll be good to have that wing option as well. And I think Matthias Rojas can play on the left wing in case Robert Taylor has to sit out. Just another option in attack, and it'll be great to have that option.
Yeah, we have all of a sudden realized that we're incredibly thin in terms of our attacking options. Once Robert Taylor went down, we really only had the kid or maybe playing Diego Gomez out of position, but it felt like, and maybe we should have known this all season, that there wasn't a ton of winger options, and that adding one is going to make a big difference, I think. He can also play a little bit of 10. Maybe he gives us a little bit of flexibility, but most importantly, he gives us solid, good, high-quality depth in that winger position when we go in the 4-3-3. I actually think he's going to be a really good player, but we'll have to wait and see.
I thought the same about Weigandt, man. Don't jinx it.
Yeah, we'll have to see. But anyways, tonight's episode, we decided to go ahead and look at the roster and how we got to this point. Obviously, against Monterrey 10 days ago or so, 2 weeks ago now, or sorry, 7 days ago, we didn't have any substitutes to take off the bench that at least Tata felt comfortable with, even though we felt that this was going to be a really deep team. So we thought it might be a fun and good time to go through every move we made this offseason to see how we got to where we are. And so tonight we're going to take every single move, and I counted 26 overall, and we're going to give them a grade, A, B, C, D, F, or incomplete, because there are a few that I think it's probably too early to tell. But with that said, let's just get right into it. Let's start by talking about where this team was at the end of last season. I kind of made a depth chart of what this roster looked like in the final game of the season and where we were, because it's illustrative and towards where we were, where we had to go moving forward.
This does not look like Inter Miami of today, that's for sure. There's been a lot of changes. Boy, we've come a long way.
Well, the biggest reason I wanted to put this out there is because, as you might be able to tell if you pause this and counted, there's 35 names on this list, and you're only allowed to have 30 as an MLS roster. And the reason they were able to do that is because they had 3 guys on season-ending injury, and they had 4 guys that were loaned out for the second half of last season. So the first thing to note was that they were going to have to shed players from the roster. They wouldn't just be able to do one-for-one swaps. They weren't going to be able to keep everyone that they wanted to keep just because they needed to move players. And then the second thing was they were going to have to shed some salary if they were going to add big salaries, which they were already planning to do with Luis Suárez, and who knows how long Julian Gressel was in the pipeline. But yeah, anything from this list that really stands out to you, I kind of have them separated by position.
I would almost say that the center back depth looks better than what we have currently. And if I could go back in time and bring those center back options into the present day Inter Miami team, dare I say we beat Monterrey with this defensive depth.
Yeah, listen, we'll talk about Kamal Miller, and that might be the most interesting grade that we give, because there's a lot of context to why that move had to be made. But now that we've seen how everything played out, it kind of gives us this lens with which to view that move. So why don't we kick it right off? There's going to be a few that we don't get, mostly because I forgot to make a graphic for them. I'm thinking Harvey Neville moving to Portland didn't make it just because I forgot to make a graphic for it. But other than that, I think we have virtually everyone. And the first one we're going to start with is October 25th. Inter Miami publishes their postseason roster plans, and they announced 4 players are not going to be renewed, starting with Josef Martínez, who was our #1 striker last season. I think he had 12 goals, played the more minutes than Campana, had a couple games where he was the difference in the game. And so he's a player that, with a big MLS history, you'd feel like Inter Miami might want to keep if they could, except for the fact that we already knew there was another all-star striker that we were going to be getting soon. So it felt like that played a big part in us deciding not to bring back Josef Martínez.
Yeah, I think letting a MLS veteran go in favor of a young up-and-coming striker in the,
And to be clear, I'm talking about Luis Suárez.
To be clear, I'm also talking about Luis Suárez.
Oh, okay, sorry. Apologies.
I think in terms of long-term planning, it's worked out. Josef Martínez was never prolific for us, and it was always more about his potential rather than him actually converting those into goals. And if you ask me to swap Luis Suárez for Josef Martínez, even Luis Suárez of today, I would do that in a heartbeat. So I think overall, very positive in terms of planning by Chris Henderson and the team.
Yeah, and Josef Martínez probably at that time was looking for maybe not a DP contract, but a bigger contract than he ended up getting. He ends up signing with CF Montreal, but not until he spent a lot of time trying to attract interest from some of the biggest clubs in Brazil and Argentina. And so it just felt like with Luis Suárez coming back and Campana under contract, there really was no room for Josef Martínez. So with that said, give me your grade, letting Josef Martínez leave.
Before I give you my grade, do we know how many goals he scored this season? That might determine my grading.
I can look it up.
Because I don't think it's that many.
I would imagine it's not. He certainly, by the time we got him, was not the same player that he was for Atlanta for so many years when he was one of the best players in the league. It looks like he's got 2 goals so far.
Yeah, so in grand scheme of things, with the replacement that we got in for him, I would give this a solid B+.
Yeah, I'm going to give it an A because considering we already knew we had Luis Suárez in the bag, there was no reason to bring him back, and just letting him go made sense, and then he can pursue his career whatever way that he feels necessary. Like I said, that day, October 25th, we made 4 decisions. That was the first. The second one, Victor Ulloa, who has been with the club since the beginning. He was one of the founding members. Him, Robbie Robinson, and Drake Callender are the only remaining players from that original team. And it was time to go, I think. He didn't play a ton last season. He played 16 games, 13 of them off the bench. He didn't play much with Phil Neville. He didn't play at all with Javier Morales. It seemed like Tata Martino gave him a little bit of life, gave him a few bench appearances, maybe just because he's a veteran, maybe because he was a new coach and wanted to see what he had. But it really did feel downhill for Victor Ulloa, who is, I believe, 29 or 30. Maybe you wouldn't say by his age that he's finished, but it felt like his best legs were behind him.
Yeah, and considering that it was sort of a new chapter for Inter Miami with all the acquisitions that we were making in the midfield and the youngsters coming up as well, he didn't really have a place in this roster anyways. And keeping him would have been more nostalgia than anything else. And as you said, I think it was time to move on in general. And yeah, overall, I think this was needed.
Yeah, I think when you're in a roster crunch like we were, or we have been, I think letting Victor Ulloa go, no doubt makes a lot of sense. What's your grade for it?
I would go with another B+ or an A.
Then I will give the A so that you can give the B+. Some of these are just going to be sort of obvious things that had to happen, and so maybe those should be our standard grades for this. Victor Ulloa, a longtime Inter Miami player, and I'm sure has a lot of fans for people that have been there for the entire time. But in this roster, in this lineup, he doesn't make a lot of sense. And, we'll get to how much midfield depth we have, but certainly I don't think he would be getting a lot of game time nowadays. Moving forward to someone that fans might not be familiar with, and that's Jake LaCava. Jake LaCava was signed from the Tampa Bay Rowdies after the 2022 season. Clearly, Inter Miami saw something from him in the USL that they liked. He didn't make a big impact. I think he got 2 bench appearances, both in the US Open Cup against second division teams. And then in the summer, he gets sent on loan back to the Tampa Bay Rowdies. He ended up signing with Charleston, I believe, in the USL after Inter Miami let him go. But any thoughts on Jake LaCava, or you just want to go straight to grades?
Not too many thoughts. Again, one that had to happen. Can't say much.
You B+ for consistency?
Yeah.
Okay, and I'll give it an A just because I agree, had to happen for his career, for Inter Miami's roster building. He can go back to a level where he can shine at, and Inter Miami can move on with that roster spot. The last one, and I think this one's the more controversial one, and the one maybe we'll have more to talk about. That's Dixon Arroyo. Same day. At the time, they announced that they were still working with him to see if there was a new contract that might be available for him at Inter Miami. He actually had an option that they declined. Last season, he made $150K, which is not that big of a salary with considering his role last season. I think he played the 5th most minutes on the team. He came in when Gregore and Jean Mota got injured, and he kind of stabilized that defense. And by the end of the season, when Inter Miami was at its best, he was the 6, playing next to Busquets, covering for him. Kremaski also in that midfield, and it made a really balanced midfield. So I was a little surprised when it was announced that he wasn't going to be coming back.
Yeah, I think I would have been okay with letting Arroyo go if Gregore was still on the roster. I think without Gregore, losing Dixon Arroyo as well, there's a lot of imbalance in that midfield. And we know that Busquets performs best when he has a defensive midfielder sitting next to him. And I think at this point in time in this midfield, we only have Yannick Bright, who's an out-and-out defensive midfielder, because I would say that even Redondo isn't an out-and-out defensive midfielder. So I would think Dixon Arroyo, letting him go without actually having a balanced idea of what the midfield setup looks like, maybe not the best, because we know we're awful at defensive transitions. And this could have been one of those, temporary plugins that we could have had up until the summer, until we go and get out maybe a better defensive midfielder.
Yeah, listen, here we are. Inter Miami has a ton of really good midfielders on the roster. And it feels like, we'll get to this, but it feels like Inter Miami was always going to try and go out and get a really big name young midfielder to fill out that final U22 spot or to fill out the last DP spot. So they could see that they were going to have a glut of midfielders. They already had a bunch of young midfielders on the roster. But again, just like you said, he added a balance to this team and a stability. He partnered well with Busquets defensively. He made the midfield comfortable. He allowed Busquets to get forward and be more of a playmaker. And he was comfortable sitting back and just being a 6. Yes, I feel like we have Yannick Bright that does similar things, although I'm not sure he's definitely not as experienced as Arroyo, and he's not probably at that level yet. But also, Bright, we didn't know we were going to get Bright at that point. And also, Bright is a college draft pick. I mean, I feel weird putting that sort of pressure on him to be Dixon Arroyo, because Dixon Arroyo really stabilized the midfield last season.
Yeah, and bringing in Redondo obviously was a decision, but I'm not sure if Redondo was brought in to be Sergio Busquets' replacement, or what he was brought in to be that defensive midfield position. Not sure what the thinking behind this particular move was, but one that I can potentially see not getting a B+ or an A.
Yeah, and at the time, we still had Gregore. We still had Jean Mota. We still had some guys that you thought, especially Gregore, who might be the 6. But Dixon Arroyo was pretty cheap. And so I think maybe having that player on the roster would have been nice going forward. But I can understand why the club made the decision that they did. They also probably knew they were going to be in need of international roster slots. And so I imagine that more than anything played into this. Give me your grade.
C+.
I'm going to give it a C. I feel like they could have used him to stabilize this midfield. He was also sort of an Iron Man, played for them, was always healthy, never got injured. And so I think he could play a role in this team. And I think maybe he would have been a trade chip this summer if they had kept him on the roster. So yeah, I'm going to give it a C because I think they could have handled the situation better. And them not understanding they needed a 6 probably was a mistake by this team. And I think they knew at the time that they probably were going to have to let Gregore go. So yeah, let's move on to the next one. We're getting to the MLS Super Draft. They make a trade from the 3rd overall pick to the 15th overall pick. We're not going to grade that one, but it is a transaction of note. And we're going to go to their 15th overall pick. That was Yannick Bright. talk to me about Yannick Bright.
He's going to be so important for this team as we move forward. I think he surprised everybody. We saw it in preseason that he's a very composed midfielder, mature as well. He's obviously not on the younger side in terms of up-and-coming talent, but he's definitely got that maturity to his game and that composure on the ball that makes him a great defensive midfielder. And he might not get tremendous amount of minutes in the starting 11, but I think he's going to be a very useful utility player, at least this year, and off the bench option. And then I think next year he's going to have a fantastic contribution to this team. So very exciting prospect, and I look forward to his development.
Yeah, you hear all the time about players that are going to be here in the post-Messi era. And it feels like this is one of the few that actually might not just be around, but be an impactful player. A lot of our young players probably have their eye towards moving on to bigger clubs at some point over the next 2 years. But this feels like a player who could be a cornerstone of our midfield for the next 7-8 years. And I'm really excited about Yannick Bright. I do think he provides what Dixon Arroyo provides, but he just doesn't have that talent or experience yet to demand to be played. And maybe he'll get there at some point this season. But as far as a super draft pick, I think this has to be an A+. Inter Miami has really struggled with their super draft picks virtually for their entire existence. Robbie Robinson, they drafted first overall back in 2020. 2 picks later, they drafted Dylan Nealis, who didn't even make it to season 2. He's now a backup with the Red Bulls. They drafted Joshua Penn with the 10th overall pick. He made 2 appearances and now is in the USL. Ryan Saylor was the 9th overall pick in 2022. He's an MLS player, but not an MLS starter. And Yannick Bright at 15th is seemingly a guy with the potential to be an impact player. So I don't know how you could do anything but an A+ for this player or for this draft pick.
Completely agree.
Next, we go to the 24th overall pick, and that's Ryan Carmichael. We haven't seen him yet for the first team, but he has made his debut for the second team for the IMCF 2. He scored a couple goals already. I'll just be honest. When I was going into the super draft, I really wanted them to take a striker with that second pick in the first round, because I wanted them to provide a bit of competition for Schneider Borgelin for the third striker role. And I felt the super draft might be able to provide that. I don't know if Ryan Carmichael's there yet. I don't know if he's going to prove himself to be worthy of that at any point moving forward, but I like the decision. And for that, I'm going to give it an A-.
Yeah, I haven't seen him play, but so I don't have too much of an informed opinion on what the grade should be. But it seems like the academy is doing really, really well in terms of bringing in young talent and developing them. And Inter Miami too seems to be doing decently well. So I would agree with you on this. I would also give this an A-. And yeah, moving on to the next one.
Second round pick, Leo Afonso. Again, Inter Miami has not had much success from the super draft at all. And here we have a player that wasn't in their plans, showed up in Fort Lauderdale and forced himself into their plans. He already gets a first team contract. He's already made 4 appearances, scored his first goal. He looks like a player that's a real MLS player. Maybe not an MLS star, an MLS starter, but an MLS player for sure. And to get him with the 31st overall pick in the second round, I think that's also an A+.
Yeah, I would say an A or an A+ on this as well, because I think he probably doesn't have the same level of impact that Yannick Bright does, but there's definitely something he's doing right in training, because Tata Martino has not been hesitant to use him as an option off the bench, and already scored a goal. He's very dynamic, exciting player, and I can't wait to see what he does. So I would give this an A.
Yeah, same. A+ for me. And then the last super draft pick before we leave the super draft, they get Pep Casas, third pick in the third round. Any thoughts on Pep? Again, for a third round pick in the super draft, for him to even make a single MLS appearance, I think is a win. And so for that matter, I'm giving him an A+.
I would give this another A. I think he's played 2 appearances, I believe, or 1.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, of course, he hasn't had the same impact as Leo Afonso, as I mentioned earlier. But we seem to have really done well with this year's Super Draft, and there's a lot of exciting prospect. And I'm sure we're going to see him a couple of more times in the season, because we can bring him back up at a maximum of 4 times. So next year is going to be very interesting when we have all of these options available, and we'll see who actually grows into a potential starter for us and this team, and who stays on and who gets moved on.
Okay, let's leave the Super Draft and let's get to some fun conversations. That was December 19th. 3 days later, they signed Luis Suárez from Grêmio. Superstar. I don't know what else to say.
If we did this particular podcast before the season had started and based on the preseason, this would have probably made a C- or a D, because there were so many questions asked about this particular signing and this particular player. Everyone thought he lost his knees. Everyone thought he no longer was the same player that he used to be in his Premier League and La Liga days. He's going to be the MVP this year. So he's absolutely shut the critics up, and it's fantastic acquisition. Chris Henderson seems to know what he's doing. So good for us.
Yeah, well, I don't want to give Chris Henderson too much credit for this one. This was all Lionel Messi and Sergio Busquets. And to get this type of player for less than a DP contract, it's a grand slam. There's no doubt about it. An A+ for me. I don't even feel like there's a lot to say about this, because he's going to win the MVP and he's not even on a DP contract.
We might need a grade above A+, but I agree with you.
Okay, let's get into a controversial one. A player that played a lot last season was an impact player for this team, in my opinion, and then he gets traded out of the blue. And of course, that's Kamal Miller. It becomes official on December 30th. Inter Miami trades Kamal Miller to the Portland Timbers for $500,000 in GAM and an international roster slot. He also took up an international roster slot, so it was like freeing up 2. But also, this was your number 1 center back last season. I want to delve into this trade a little bit more, because it feels like this is like the biggest impact move of the entire offseason in terms of departures for this club right now. But give me your top line thoughts.
There are a couple of things. Obviously, this was controversial in terms of the player and his impact on the team. But what he brought in exchange in terms of the international roster slot, in terms of the GAM, it felt like we had to make this big move in order to complete the roster that we're trying to build out. So it was a double-edged sword, because we're losing out on a fantastic player, but we're gaining quite a lot of room in terms of how we want to build this roster up. But if you ask me today if I'd bring him back, I would say yes, without a hesitation, because the defense has been definitely an area where we're struggling. And if you ask me which one player you want as a defensive option in your back line, I would either say Bambito or I'll say Kamal Miller. So I think it was a big loss if you see it in hindsight.
Yeah, Kamal Miller was good on the ball, especially for an MLS center back. And so to have him back there, especially with the trouble we've had with playing out of the back, and we know this is what Tata Martino wants to do, he would have been really nice to have. I want to give some more context for this trade, because there's a few aspects to it that I think maybe aren't obvious on the top line. The first is that I think by the end of the offseason, it became clear that MLS teams had a no trade with Miami unwritten rule, unspoken rule going, because Inter Miami had a lot of players that were worth something that they really struggled to offload all offseason, and at least until the very end. DeAndre Yedlin, Chris McVey, these types of players were guys that Inter Miami thought going into the offseason they probably would be able to offload relatively quickly and easily and get something in return for them. And it was clear that MLS teams weren't biting. And we saw some quotes come out later in the offseason from other MLS executives. And at least to me, it became clear that there was some animosity towards Inter Miami for building what they've built. And that that played out in why they weren't able to offload some of these other contracts earlier, and why Inter Miami was forced to make this trade because this was a player that other teams, specifically Portland, were willing to part with immediately and to pay at least a reasonable price for. That is one bit of context. And then the second bit of context was almost immediately after they traded Kamal Miller, they were linked with a couple of high-profile center backs. Victor Cuesta and David Martinez are the two that really stood out to me as potential options. Marcos Rojo, another player, but I'm not sure how serious that was. But they had two Argentine center backs that it felt, well, I guess David Martinez is from Paraguay, but it felt like guys that Inter Miami was about to land, and then they couldn't close the deal on either player. Does that change how you view this trade? Because they did feel like they had another player lined up to replace him, and then it didn't go through. They end up signing Nicolás Freire on loan a couple weeks later, but I don't know. Those two things, how does that impact your thoughts on this trade?
Yeah, especially the second aspect of it, of the backup option or who you want to bring in apart from Kamal Miller or in exchange for Kamal Miller. I think the fact that we got a Nico Freire, I'm a bit on the fence about what I think about Nico Freire. He's had a good start, but it's not been amazing. It's not been transformative, to say the least, in terms of his impact on the back line. So knowing that we didn't get our first choice centre-back replacement for Kamal Miller kind of dampens this particular trade, specifically because of our defensive struggles this particular season. And again, hindsight 2020, we can sit here and lament about this trade, but overall, it might have been maybe not a necessity, but we needed to let go of a big player in order to build the roster how we wanted to and get in some of the players that we might not have been able to get if Kamal Miller was not let go. So it's a two-way sword and a double-edged sword and a two-way street, and it feels like something that in hindsight we regret, but we had to do.
I would really love to have Kamal Miller on this roster. At the beginning of the offseason, I talked about how that I wanted them to add a top-line center back to the roster as is and pair him with Kamal Miller. And so if we could have paired Kamal Miller with a Freire or a player like that, Victor Cuesta, and then have Aviles be the third center back, and those three kind of rotate and get a lot of starts together, to me, that would have been ideal. And instead, we got rid of our top center back from last season, and we got Nicolás Freire, who, although he has been decent at times, also hasn't been an obvious upgrade yet. And then more importantly, Kamal Miller played every single game. He never got hurt. He missed one game because of a red card suspension, and he missed a few games on international duty. But other than that, he started basically every game. And Nicolás Freire, we've already seen, has had some injuries, and Sergei Kristov has had some injuries. And so I think it's hard to call going from Kamal Miller to Nicolás Freire an upgrade, but having the $500K in GAM and having the international roster slot is helpful and is nice. So with all that said, give me your grade.
I'm going to go with a C+, I think.
Why C plus?
Or a C. Make it a C.
Okay. Why a C?
Specifically because I think in terms of the balance and pros and cons, losing out on a player like Kamal Miller seems to have had a bigger impact than gaining that international roster slot. And I feel like at this point, if I could bring back a defender, I would probably bring back Kamal Miller. So, and I think if he was on the field against Monterrey, he could have potentially stopped them from destroying us.
Yeah, to me, the biggest thing is just his ability to play out of the back. If this is what you wanted, Freire is okay, but he's not Kamal Miller, and then Aviles really struggles with that. So I'm going to give this a D. I think they panicked a little bit at the beginning of the offseason when they were struggling to trade some of their less valued players, and other MLS teams weren't biting. And so I think they made this move to try and make it easier for them. And then they found out that by the end of the window, it wasn't going to be hard, or it wasn't going to be impossible to move those players. So I'm giving it a D. I think this team would be better if Kamal Miller was on it. And I think that there was a way that was possible, but maybe not. Moving on. January 9th, Inter Miami announces that they're signing Julian Gressel. They needed a player that could be reliable, to be consistent, to be a creator, especially when Lionel Messi wasn't going to be on the pitch, because we knew Messi was going to miss a lot of games for international duty, and now it turns out he's missed a few because of injury. Give me your thoughts on Julian Gressel.
This might sound controversial, but I feel like the reason that we brought him in hasn't necessarily been fulfilled in the games that we've seen him play. I feel like there is obviously a lot of hype about him. He's a great player, but I don't think he's fulfilled his potential up until now. And he hasn't looked amazing. He's looked good. He's looked fine. But I think in terms of what he could potentially offer to this team, we haven't seen any of that as of now. And I'm not sure, maybe I'm remiss in saying this, but we could potentially have gotten a better player of that quality and of that value who might have had a better impact on this team. And I know this sounds controversial, but as of now, my opinion of him hasn't been the most positive. He's shown glimpses. That's what I'm going to say.
Yeah, imagine this. You don't trade Kamal Miller. You don't get rid of Kamal Miller's salary. You don't get that $500K in GAM. And then you also don't sign Julian Gressel, but you keep Kamal Miller. I think I would make that trade-off. This seems like a player to me that Tata likes and wanted, and Chris Henderson wanted to make that happen for him, because Chris Henderson's always going to, try and get the guys that the coaches want. That's just his style. You're right. I don't think he's been excellent. I think that maybe there was a plan in place for us to play a lot of 3-5-2, and Julian Gressel was going to be a star in that right wing back spot. And then it turns out that we suck at the 3-5-2 and that we should scrap it as much and as frequently as possible. And all of a sudden, you don't really have a obvious role for Julian Gressel in a starting 11. I think Julian Gressel is a good player. I think he's a guy that on another team could be their best player and could be really impactful. He had a huge impact for Vancouver. He was really good in Atlanta. He's a guy that you can have be the focal point of your offense, but you have to commit to it, and you have to build the offense around him. And this team was never going to do that. And so to me, it's been sort of a letdown because we haven't been able to find a perfect role for him, and that the role that we're trying to squeeze him into just isn't perfect for him. And so we've seen some struggles because of it. Give me your grade and why.
Before I give my grade, I like to reiterate your point that he doesn't fit the profile of the player that we need in that position. I think he slows the game down a little bit too much. And because he's playing second fiddle essentially to our main creator, Lionel Messi, I don't think he has a future role in this team that we may have envisioned. So I'm not too sure about this trade overall. I would say it's a B-, and maybe going forward he improves and proves me wrong, but I would say I want to give him the benefit of doubt. I'm going to say a B-, maybe even a C+.
Yeah, as we're doing this today, I'm going to give him a C. I think that there's the potential for him to be an impact player for this team. So I don't want to discount him, but I do struggle to see it. I think that this could end up being a real disaster if Tata Martino isn't retained long-term. He did sign a 4-year contract, or 3 years plus an option year. So he's in it for the long haul. And yeah, I think, they should have known better. Tata Martino should have known better that he was going to need athletic players to surround Lionel Messi and Luis Suárez with, because neither of them were going to be, defensive players that helped run the game. And we got a lot of athletic players, and we've seen a step up from Diego Gomez, and we've seen Kramaski be really good, and we added Redondo, and we added Cello Weigandt, and this just feels so out of place compared to everyone else that we added, that it's like a Tata Martino, this is my guy, I want him. And now we have to try and figure out the best way to use him. So right now I'm giving it a C. I do think there's the potential that he ends up being a really important player for us down the road. I could see him winning 2 or 3 games for us just by himself. So we'll see. But for now, that's what we're going with. Those are some of the fun conversations. Let's move to some more basic things. The next day, the team announces that they're signing Tyler Hall to a first-team contract. The reason I brought this up, because we're going to do Israel Boatwright too. He signed the same day. On January 10th, these two players signed first-team contracts, even though Inter Miami was in a roster crunch. And so the reason I want to grade these moves is not because these players don't deserve first-team contracts, because I believe both do. But what difference would it have made if we signed them to first-team contracts on January 10th versus April 24th? When the window closed, we knew what our roster was going to be, and these guys weren't able to be used as tools in negotiating, bargaining tools and all these things where other teams were saying, you're desperate to move players, so we're going to make it harder. We're going to give you less to do it. It just felt unnecessary at the time. I don't know why they chose to do it in early January.
Yeah, the timing seemed off, because think of it this way, right? If any of our players throughout from January to April had got a major injury that we needed to replace, having those two spots of Boatwright and Hall not fulfilling our roster would have given us some room to maneuver. We obviously might not have been able to bring in a massive replacement for someone like a Redondo in case Redondo was out for the season or something. But it would have definitely given us a lot more flexibility going into the final days of the transfer window and seeing how the roster builds out from January to April, because 4 months is a lot. And in that time, you're potentially entering a semifinal in CONCACAF, and you need to understand how this roster is coming together. So in terms of flexibility, this was just tying your hands behind your back, I think.
Yeah, listen, it could go the opposite way too. They could be saying, listen, we have this young center back we believe in. We have this young right back we believe in. So actually, we don't really need DeAndre Yedlin. We don't need Chris McVey. So we can kind of trade them as early as we want or as late as we want. So maybe it was a bargaining tool the other way. I don't know. But I think that these two players, the signing is interesting because of the timing. And it's not the first time Inter Miami's done this. Last season in the summer, they signed Santi Morales, who we have yet to see perform, debut for the first team. So we'll see. At the time, Tyler Hall, he was coming off the under-17 World Cup with the U.S. Youth National Team. And so maybe we thought he's about to be a player that's ready for the MLS. As it turns out, that's not really the case. He's still with the B team. And so, yeah, what's your grade?
C.
I'm going to give it a C+ just because I do like these guys' upside and potential. And so getting them locked down was nice. And I don't know if they were threatening to leave or whatever. And so, yeah. Israel Boatwright, it's the same conversation. You needed to move Harvey Neville, and you probably needed to move DeAndre Yedlin at some point. And so having a right back on the roster, especially for Harvey Neville, saying, no, actually, this guy can be our right back. You don't need to hold it against us for Harvey Neville. Maybe they were trying to build leverage. I don't know. But give me your thoughts on Israel Boatwright, that signing.
I think he's a potential decent right back option that we have. I'm surprised we haven't seen more of him. And I saw you tweet out the other day that why isn't Boatwright playing, right? I believe you tweeted that out. But yeah, I would like to see more of him, because we were struggling when we let go of Yedlin to bring in Weigandt. There was a bit of a gap in there. And I wouldn't have minded seeing Israel Boatwright in that right back position instead of playing the dreaded 3-5-2 all over again and then struggling through that. So I don't know what the thinking for Tata is there, why he's so stubborn on not playing Israel Boatwright when there's definitely a player there. But I like him. I like his profile, and I'd probably give it a little bit more than a C+ in this. I give him a B- because I think there's definitely potential for him to be a good player for us.
Yeah, and going to that point, there were games for him to play. On the road at DC United, home versus Montreal, home versus NYC. I guess we had Cello at that point, but there was a game or two where he could have been an option, and it seems like Tata Martino is not ready to play him. And listen, one of the things about Tata Martino was that he historically was not great at bringing academy kids through to the first team, and hopefully that's Israel Boatwright's not going to be a victim of that this season. But he has been injured, and I believe he's been injured for the last couple of weeks since international duty because he hasn't played for the B team either. We'll see. I'm gonna give it a C plus, same as Tyler Hall. It's the same conversation. I don't really know if there was a difference between him signing January 10th and him signing, next week. So I'm going to give it a little bit of a downgrade just because I think it ruined some of your flexibility with the roster. Moving on back to the starting lineup, we got Nicolás Freire, January 23rd. It's about 3.5 weeks after we traded Kamal Miller. We had moved through some of the more interesting names that we were interested in at center back. Victor Cuesta, David Martinez, again, like I mentioned, they weren't going to work out. And Inter Miami was pretty desperate for a center back at this point. They had lost Kamal Miller, and they were living with Christophe Aviles and Chris McVey being sort of their three-headed monster. Ryan Saylor is sort of a fourth guy, and then Tyler Hall. So they didn't have a lot of center backs in training. They didn't have a lot of center backs to take on the international tour. Talk to me about Nicolás Freire.
We've had a conversation about where we mentioned that defenders are an area where MLS teams struggle to fill. Like, there's a lack of good quality defenders in the MLS. If you're comparing Kamal Miller to Nico Freire, I would take Kamal Miller over him. But I think there's definitely a player here. He's shown glimpses of how good he can be. And I've talked about this. When Nico Freire is in the team, when he's fit and he's playing well, Toto Aviles plays well. And the organization of the defense just improves when he's playing. I personally prefer him over Christoph. If I'd not known about the Kamal Miller trade at all, without even thinking about that or associating that particular trade with this, I would say he's a good acquisition. He makes our defense better. Is he an upgrade on Kamal Miller? I don't think so. But overall, I would definitely take him in our defense, and I'd say he's probably our first choice center back at this point in time. Can't play in the 3-5-2, much like the rest of the defensive setup, but I think he's going to get better as he moves on because he's only just played, 10 games?
Yeah, the Kamal Miller conversation is just a part of this where it felt like when they traded Kamal Miller, they must have an option in mind that they're about to pull the trigger on, and it just wasn't the case, or it didn't turn out to be the case. They found Nico Freire a little bit later. He must have been down their list a little bit more. So to me, the biggest thing with him is going to be his injury record. Can he play a lot? Because Kamal Miller did play every single game. And Nico Freire, he was hurt in the preseason. He's been hurt lately. He needs to be able to stay healthy. And because it's not too far from him getting hurt and Christoph getting hurt, and all of a sudden you're playing Aviles and Ryan Saylor or, Tyler Hall or whatever. So, yeah, give me your grade on this one.
I'd say a C+, but I think there's room for improvement here.
I'm going to give it a B-. They did need a center back, and so they went out and they got one. They got a left-footed center back, which is nice. He is a physical presence, and I think he does help them in set-piece defense, which was a problem for them last year. And so in that one regard, I think he's definitely an upgrade on Kamal Miller. And so to me, you went out, you got a new center back to be a starter. He upgraded in one of the areas that you're a little bit weak at. I can see what the thinking is. I think when we find out how much he's making, which won't be for another 6 months, but once we find out what his cap charge was, I think this grade might change, because if he's relatively cheap, I think it's a great signing. I would love to have him and Kamal Miller, but if he's relatively cheap, it's a great signing. If he's costing $1 million, then it's a bad signing. So for now, while we don't know that, I'm giving it a B-, which takes us to this point in time where we have too many players on the roster. I think we had 36 or 37, and we were desperate to shed players. Kamal Miller was really the only player at this point that we had shed. We were at 37 players without signing any of the draft picks. So then we start shedding players. The first, January 31st, Nico Stefanelli gets sold to a club in Hungary, Fehérvár. He always seemed like a guy that had to go. He wasn't going to fit into this this Lionel Messi era of Inter Miami. It was nice to get him off the books to a club in, overseas. You get a little bit of a transfer fee, and then, he's off your books and you don't have to worry about it anymore. international roster slot open as well.
Yeah, I think with Campana as a second backup and then as a backup and then Luis Suárez as our primary striker, I think this was one that we had to make, and there wasn't much flexibility. We had to shed off players at this point to make roster compliancy. So it was one that we expected and one that we needed to make. So overall, a decent decision.
Yeah. Listen, we've talked about it, and we'll talk more about it, how we could use another winger or two on this depth chart, and Stefanelli could have been that, but also I don't think his play last year dictated that he was good enough to make this roster. I don't think he's the kind of player that is going to play a lot for an MLS Cup champion or CONCACAF Champions Cup champion, and so to me, he was an obvious move. His contract wasn't too big, but it was substantial enough to say there's just no role for you on this team at that level. So had to get rid of him. Did it relatively easily. I would have loved for them to do it a month, at the beginning of the month, but they get it done by the end of the European transfer window. What's your grade?
I give this a solid B+.
Yeah, I'm going to give it an A. The only thing that keeps it from an A+ is just them doing it earlier. I don't know if they got any GAM out of this, but if they did, that would make it even better. It had to be done, and they got it done. So good to see. They also, he knew that he had to leave, and he was talking with a club from Chile, and that kind of fell through, but he makes it over to Hungary. He was sort of on board to make this happen, even if reluctantly. He kind of knew that this was his future. So I give it an A because it was easy and painless. Speaking of relatively easy and painless, our next one, February 1st, Inter Miami trades Chris McVey to DC United. This was on the tour. We were still a little short on center backs. At this time, we still wanted to sign another center back. At least as fans, we wanted to sign another center back.
We still want another center back.
Yeah, we still do. Again, I would have loved for this to happen on December 5th and not February 1st. This feels like one of those players that Inter Miami should have been able to offload a little bit easier. He had a marginally successful 2022 playing as a fullback. It didn't quite translate to center back, but listen, he's a starting center back for DC United. He's a starting center back in this league. His contract's not too big. This should have been a player that Inter Miami had less trouble offloading than they did. And I think that goes back to what I was talking about with other MLS execs, where they weren't going to do anything to help Inter Miami. Inter Miami doesn't get the value I think they probably should have, but they needed to make this move because they didn't have roster space for him.
Yeah, and to be fair, Chris McVey was, not the quality that we want. We definitely can get an upgrade on him. He went to DC United. I remember when we were playing DC United earlier in the season, the conversation was that Chris McVey is one of their more prominent players in the starting 11, and he's starting to have an impact for them. I'm looking at how well they're doing, and they've got 4 draws, 2 losses, and 2 wins. And we beat them fairly comfortably. I don't think this was a player that I miss on our, team sheet, and one that we had to let go. Yeah,
one other aspect to this was, if you looked really closely at the game log last season, you might get the impression that Tata Martino, by the end, favored Ryan Sailor over Chris McVey, because Chris McVey lost his job early in the season, but he got a few bench appearances under Tata in the first game or two, and then he wasn't seen again. Ryan Sailor did get a few appearances after that. So I think maybe in Tata's mind, he fell below Ryan Sailor on the depth chart. I don't know if that's true or not, but just another added thing. Give me your grade for that.
I would say an A for this.
Yeah, I'm gonna give it a B, because actually I'm gonna give it a C+, because I think they should have been able to get this done back in December, and I think not getting it done that early kind of handicapped what they were able to do in terms of adding players. As you'll see for several of the next couple players we talk about, they were in full-on scramble to get players off the roster and to get roster compliant at this point, and so it would have been nice if they could have done this 6 weeks earlier, but at least it was 6 weeks early. At least it was February 1st and not the night before the first game of the season. The next one, and this one would probably be pretty quick. We loan Emerson Rodríguez to Millonarios in Colombia. This is the club we bought him from. He's a U22 DP. He was never going to make this roster just because we didn't have a U22 spot available for him. He is on a 6-month loan with an option to buy from Millonarios. I don't have any idea if he's playing or playing well. I don't have any idea if they plan to activate that. So I guess let's grade the fact that it's a 6-month loan and we might have the same problem again in the summer versus, whether he needed to go or not, because he did.
At this point, we needed to offload players, and one way or another, whether it's a 6-month loan or whether he's permanently sold, I think this was a good move either ways. I would give it an A and not an A+, just because he wasn't sold permanently, but I think this was someone that we needed to get out in order to make roster compliance.
Yeah, he was on loan at Santos Laguna in Mexico last year, and I think Inter Miami really wanted them to just exercise the purchase option. Didn't happen. I'm gonna give this a B-, just because you would have liked to sell him for sure or trade him, but I think that was going to be really difficult with his contract situation, and so loaning him for the whole season and not having to worry about it till next year would have been nicer than loaning him for 6 months. But we'll see. Moving forward, let's go to Edison Azcona. We loan him to the Las Vegas Lights for the 2024 season in the USL. They have a purchase option on him. Again, he's a homegrown player. He has made 11 appearances over the last 4 seasons, or 3 seasons, I guess. He never really became a first-team player, in my opinion, and I don't think he's going to come back to Inter Miami, honestly. You needed to move a player off the roster, even though he's a supplemental roster slot player. I think this is good for him, and so that's why I'm going to give it a relatively positive grade. Give me your thoughts.
Yeah, he hasn't lit the Las Vegas Lights in any way either. No pun intended. He's played 3 games, hasn't scored a goal. Overall, I think this was a move that was needed for him. He needed game time. We needed more. We need to get players off our books, and this was one that we at the time knew was going to happen. So again, I think it was a positive move overall for all parties.
Yeah, he was one of the 6 homegrowns that played in that DC United game last year where Inter Miami set the record for the most number of homegrowns on the roster at the same time. He'll always have that as sort of a special moment in Inter Miami history. But yeah, it just he wasn't going to play a lot. And so for us, him making this loan move was probably for the best. And again, I don't think we're going to see him back at Inter Miami. Give me your grade.
A.
Yeah, I agree. I'm going to give it an A just because I think if he is as talented as Inter Miami once thought he was, he'll make it at the Las Vegas Lights, and then he'll make himself a professional soccer player, which is, an excellent job to do. Let's go to another controversial one. That was February 19th. A few hours later, it's announced that we sold Gregore to Botafogo in Brazil. He was our only defensive midfielder. We saw him some in the preseason. He looked to be his old self, very athletic, very physical, in guys' faces, but his contract probably wasn't going to work. He was a DP level. He had a DP level cap charge. Listen, he was Inter Miami's captain for 3 seasons, I guess 2+ seasons, and we miss him as a player, and it would be awesome to keep him around, but I just don't know if it was ever really feasible.
They could have made it work, man. They could have made it work somehow. The only silver lining of this trade for me personally was the fact that he didn't go to another MLS team and he went to Botafogo. If we had Gregore at this point next to Busquets, we would not have the defensive transition issues that we've been facing, or at least that's what I like to believe. I agree with you that it'd be harder to keep him on with the kind of contract that he was getting, but we lost a big player. This one hurts more than Kamal Miller for me, and more than, Dixon Arroyo in a similar position, but I would let go of Dixon Arroyo if we can bring back Gregore. We got a lot of money for him, yeah, but as a player, quality, and I would love to see him. Also, nostalgia-wise, he's obviously the captain of the pre-Messi era. So a lot of thoughts here. Not very happy with this trade.
Yeah, we sell him off. It's hard to grade because I feel like in the end we had to do it, and probably Chris Henderson knew we had to do it the entire offseason. I've heard that Gregore wanted to do whatever he could to stay on this team and to be part of it. And he loved Inter Miami. He really wanted to play with Messi and to see what Inter Miami could do with all this talent. But I just don't know if it was ever going to work. In my head, we'll talk about Jean Mota in a few minutes. In my head, there was a chance they were going to be able to keep one of them, but just the way it played out, it ends up not being the case. And if they were going to be able to keep one of them, I would have wanted it to be Gregore. But listen, we could have really used him over the last couple of weeks. But once Redondo gets healthy, once Benjamin Kramaski gets healthy, fully healthy, David Ruiz, it's just, I don't know if there's going to be a lot of room in the midfield for him anyways. And so, yeah, give me your grade.
I would say a C+, just because the kind of return we got for him, but I wasn't happy with it at all.
Yeah, I'll give it a C+ too. I think it was sort of one of those things where you had no choice. You had to move him on, and you did what you could, and you got what you could, and you waited till the last second to try and see if there was any other way. I think we played the first game on February 21st, so they were coming down to the wire. It feels like they probably did try to do everything they could to maybe keep this player. So nothing they could do. I give it a C+. The next day, as part of this effort to get roster compliance, they do use their one-time buyout on Coco Jean. Jean was here for about 18 months. We got him in the summer of 2022. He barely played that year because he got injured. And then last season, he was sort of a starter for us in the first 10 or so games. Then he got injured again. We never saw him. I never thought he was an impact player. He was on a relatively big wage. I never felt that he was good enough to demand that wage in terms of the impact he had on the field. Again, we wish probably that there was another winger on this roster that we could use, but for that salary charge, cap charge, and for the level of impact he was bringing, there was just no way that they were going to be able to keep this player. He was the guy that you could circle at the end of last season as the guy you're going to use your one-time cap charge on. They probably spent the entire offseason trying to either sell him abroad or trade him somewhere in the MLS, but it was going to be impossible to trade him in the MLS, and to sell him abroad probably was going to be pretty difficult too. So in the end, they're going to have to buy him out. I will say he's still training with the team. He's probably working towards the summer to try and make a return to Europe. So good vibes for everyone. But talk to me about Coco Jean.
Yeah, we all needed him to. We understood that this was coming. This was in the pipeline for a while. I think even in preseason, we didn't expect him to play a big part. Nobody expected him to be a part of the new Messi setup that we've got going. So overall, I think works out for all parties, and I wish him a speedy recovery so that he can, move on to better things, hopefully.
Yeah, Kareem puts an interesting comment in the chat that Victor Cuesta, Botafogo wouldn't trade him to, or wouldn't sell him to Inter Miami. They wanted a big fee, and then once Inter Miami moved on, they ended up letting him go for free. That's exactly the type of thing that happened to Inter Miami in every negotiation they had all summer or all winter. MLS teams wanted way more than what was realistic.
It's the Inter Miami tax.
It really was
because Beckham tax, yeah.
Well, every team knew Inter Miami was in a bad situation with the roster, and so the fact that we ended up getting where we needed to be is probably a testament to Chris Henderson. But yeah, every team was trying to abuse Inter Miami in those types of relationships. Give me your grade on Coco Jean.
I would say an A.
Yeah, I agree. He's still getting paid. Actually, I'm not going to agree. I'm going to give it a B- because I think it would have been amazing if they could. Like, there was a better way to do this. I just don't know if it was possible. So, I guess I'll give it a B because if they could have sold him abroad, that would have been amazing. It wasn't. They weren't able to do it, and that's not really a surprise given that he didn't have a huge impact in Miami, and also he still had this ACL injury. So, yeah. Let's get to another player with a little bit more context and conversation, and that's Federico Redondo. We become roster compliant for that first game against Real Salt Lake. We had to get rid of a lot of players to do it, but we made it. And this gave us the room we needed to be able to sign a young, talented midfielder. The context behind this is that Inter Miami seemingly all winter wanted a young, impactful U22 type midfielder to make this team better in the midfield, and particularly to make them better pushing the ball through without giving the ball away. Throughout January, they were attached to Christian Medina, a player at Boca Juniors, a little bit for Agustin Palavecino, who was at River Plate. And then they ended up landing on Federico Redondo, $8.5 million to bring him in, but because he's a U22, it doesn't really matter. I think they would have brought him in as a DP if that's what it took. If Facundo Farias didn't get injured, that was just sort of a fortunate turn of events, at least in terms of bringing Redondo in. Talk to me about Redondo.
I think we realized the importance of a player of his profile when he got injured. He was really starting to kick into his stride. He was impactful after his second game onwards, and I was skeptical at start. I'd seen videos of him. I knew he was a good player. I thought he would be athletic. You obviously had your own questions about the kind of fee that we're paying for him, as well as the profile that we're signing. But I was excited when he came on board, and I think he's done a fantastic job so far. The 4 games I think that he's played, he's had a good impact on a lot of them. He's strong, he's powerful, he's athletic, drives a lot in the runs. I think the midfield of him, Diego Gomez, and Sergio Busquets is the perfect balance that this team needs. And it's just a shame that he is injured for 8 weeks. God forbid it's 8 months, but 8 weeks. And hopefully he can return back to the same levels that he started off with very quickly. And I can't wait to see him on the pitch again.
Yeah, dude, I think we're going to look back on this. Let me phrase that. The MLS is going to look back at the U22 initiative in 5 years, and they're going to think this is, if not the very best one of the best ones. It's amazing that Inter Miami was able to land this player. It was amazing that Inter Miami was able to convince this player to come to the MLS. To me, it's an A+. No doubt about it.
Yeah, the fact that he was potentially being sought after by European clubs speaks volumes. Now, I don't expect him to be someone who's going to stay at Inter Miami for long, just because I think his star is going to rise and he's going to be noticed, and eventually he's going to be on his way to Europe. But the fact that he gets to play next to Sergio Busquets and with Lionel Messi, we had our reservations about whether he's going to have an immediate impact, and we wanted that to be the case because of how much money we were paying for him. And I think he's going to have that impact. I think he's going to be that player who's going to demand to be starting every single game. And for me, it's a very, very exciting prospect. The fact that we were able to pull this off, hats off to us, hats off to Chris Henderson. So A+ in this for me as well.
So it felt like this was going to be our team. We were roster compliant, cap compliant. We were in a good spot. We won our first game against Real Salt Lake. We got a draw on the road against the Galaxy, and they're a really good team. They're first in the West currently. And then we got a 5-0, that we dominated Orlando City. It felt like the team was in a really good spot. And then we traded DeAndre Yedlin. He was on a big salary, a salary probably bigger than his play dictated. He was a U.S. men's national team player for a long time. One of the few famous American soccer players by famous standards in the MLS. And so to bring him here, that dictated a big salary. He was the captain for a lot of last season when Gregore got hurt. But more importantly, he was the only right back on the roster. Go ahead and talk to me about DeAndre Yedlin.
Can I just give this a grade, please?
Go ahead.
I think this was the moment that our downward spiral started, because it just felt like a really awful time to make this particular trade. If this had come in December, that would have been fine, because the team hadn't yet started the season and we would have had a chance to fill that gap. They made this particular trade at a time when the team needed some stability, when the team needed some momentum. We were getting that momentum. And as soon as this trade happened, we just absolutely lost all of that. The fact that we couldn't play a 4-3-3 because we don't have a right back, no thinking behind this. We'll talk about Marcelo Weigandt and how he fits into all of this, whether he's the right replacement or not. But in terms of the timing and when this was done and the impact that it had on our season, specifically losing out on that first CONCACAF, awful decision overall.
Yeah, dude, I agree. I think that you're right. This was the beginning of the downfall of our season, and it has nothing to do with DeAndre Yedlin as a player. It's just that it ruined our chemistry, it ruined our formation that was working, and it ruined our play style. And the fact that they didn't have a replacement lined up immediately is the disgrace here. I think if they signed Marcelo Weigandt and then the next day if they sell the DeAndre Yedlin, the next day they sign Marcelo Weigandt, it's a good score. They probably needed to get this player's salary off the roster to give them flexibility moving forward. And so I applaud them for that. I understand the timing, because if he had played in that first Champions Cup game, he wouldn't have been eligible for any other team in the Champions Cup. He would have been cup tied. And they wanted to use him for the Champions Cup because they were in it as well. And they were the team that lost to Monterrey before us. I understand why the timing was delicate. But you told people that your primary objective was to win the CONCACAF Champions Cup, and this did a great disservice towards that goal. And the fact that it took them so long to get the replacement also did them a disservice. What's your grade?
Just because of the context and what happened afterwards, and in terms of what it meant for our season, I am very tempted to give this an F, but I'm going to give it a D-.
I'm going to give it a D. I'm just looking back. I have the Kamal Miller trade a D. I'm going to give this a D+, because I do think getting him off the roster, at least getting that salary cap charge off the roster, is probably going to give us some flexibility that we see in the summer. So I think that this could be a good move in terms of the roster flexibility, but I agree. It made your primary goal harder to achieve immediately. And that was a failure. It's now impossible, but it made it more difficult to.
But here's a question, right? Could we have not done this move in the summer?
Well, I think this goes back to Inter Miami struggling to move players within the MLS because other teams were demanding a ransom from Inter Miami. And not because Inter Miami's players weren't good enough, but because other teams seemingly wanted to take advantage of Inter Miami's situation. And even more than just normal, wanting to take advantage of your opposition, but it felt like there was some animosity towards Inter Miami for what they did last summer. So I wonder how much of this was Chris Henderson thinking, I have a chance to do it right now. Let me pull the trigger to make it happen. Because listen, there's no reason that FC Cincinnati couldn't have traded for DeAndre Yedlin back in, on January 1st, right? The fact that this happened on March 4th after the season had already started just goes to show that FC Cincinnati was, playing hardball, and I'm sure a bunch of other teams were as well. So I can see how that would have been a factor in this decision. So D+ for me. Moving on, the next day they sell Jean Mota to Vitória in Brazil. Again, a big salary charge. We have a lot of midfielders. I think Jean Mota wanted to stay on this team. I think he really wanted to stay on this team. And so he kind of left, in a frustrating manner. Just as far as the timing, I believe this was the deadline day for the Brazilian transfer window or the day before, something like that. So there was some urgency from Brazilian teams if they wanted a midfielder. And I think that's why this came together at the time it did, because the pressure was on for Vitória to add a midfielder, and this was a guy that they could sign. And so that's why that move happened on March 5th. This had to happen the entire offseason, I think. He has a big salary charge, and he wasn't going to be a very impactful player, so he had to go. I applaud them for finally getting it done.
Yeah, even though he can play multiple positions, I think he's a bit of a versatile player. I think we expected this to happen earlier, perhaps, but the fact that it happened was we knew we needed this, especially because we were getting closer to that final team setup, and we knew there were a couple of players that we wanted to bring on board. So overall, best for all parties.
Give me your grade.
I'll give this an A.
Yeah, I'm going to give it an A too. Had to happen. Good result. It didn't prevent Inter Miami from being cap compliant, and I don't think it prevented Inter Miami from doing any of the things that it wanted to do during the offseason. So good move, and glad that it got done. Then a couple weeks later, they signed Yannick Bright to a first-team contract, much the same as when we talked about Tyler Hall and Israel Boatwright. The reason I brought this up was because of timing, not so much whether Yannick Bright deserves a first-team contract. We were a little surprised that it took so long, and finally Inter Miami needed some depth, and they finally signed Yannick Bright.
I'm forgetting, was this before Redondo got injured?
I don't believe. No.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Overall,
Yes, it was before Redondo got injured. I apologize.
Yeah. We don't have a true defensive midfielder in this current roster. He has talents that are going to fit really well in terms of this midfield balance. And we've already spoken about him as a super draft pick, but we were expecting this to happen because we've seen glimpses of his capabilities in preseason. We were all very excited by the prospect that he is. And I think this will be a perfect opportunity for him to train with the first team, play alongside Sergio Busquets in some of the games. He started one game, I believe, this season already. I think he's going to start a lot more. And as the season progresses, this is going to be a player that we're going to, I think, start to fall in love with. Prospect for the future should have happened earlier, but I think this was a player that we knew as soon as he gets signed on to the first team contract, that's when our roster is potentially locked in until the summer. So once that happened, I think we knew that our roster has come together.
Give me your grade for the timing.
I would say, with the timing involved, I'd say A-.
Yeah, I just thought it should have happened earlier. I'm going to give it an A- too, but you had to get this player in the lineup, and the fact that he didn't sign a B team contract like the other 3 draft picks did showed that they were always going to, this was always in their plans, and so it was a matter of time. Moving forward, we finally, just to go back to DeAndre Yedlin, March 4th, we trade DeAndre Yedlin. March 28th, 3.5 weeks later, we finally signed Marcelo Weigandt. It was miserable. We did get a win against DC United on the road, but other than that, we had a draw in the CONCACAF Champions Cup against Nashville. We lost against Montreal. We lost against the Red Bulls. It was not a fun 3.5 weeks while we were waiting for this right back to join the team. And I'm not even convinced he's a superstar or anything like that. He's had a couple of really positive performances, and he's had a couple of relatively negative performances. Talk to me about this player.
I feel like Kareem in the chat is going to absolutely bash me again. But for me, there are a lot of factors. If this was after the first game, I would have said A+, because I think he played phenomenally in his first couple of games. Overall, the jury is still out in terms of what his impact is. Is he better than DeAndre Yedlin? Is he an upgrade? On paper, I think he is. He's shown glimpses of the capabilities and abilities that he brings to this team. He's good defensively. He's fast. He's progressive as well, has some good whips and some good crosses on him. Yet he's error prone, and he's shown that sometimes he can get lost in the game, and sometimes he can also just misplace a pass, put his team under pressure, because we like to play on the wings. We are a team that obviously we build from the center, but our wingers determine how much space our midfielders have to play. Our wing backs determine that as well. So he's going to have a really big role to play in terms of determining how well we can play against a high press, how well we can allow Lionel Messi to flourish in the center. It's a bit of a toss-up right now. He's had 2 good games. He's had 2 really bad games, but I think those bad games have kind of left everyone worried. So I will probably go with a relatively negative grade on this as of now.
I'm tempted to say it's too early to grade this move. I think the fact that it was so late is a problem. I think that we ended up getting probably a pretty good deal in terms of his cap charge, so that's nice. But yeah, it's just going to be about how he plays. And so for me, it's a little too early to tell. I'll give it a B because I just feel like if this had come a month earlier, or if we had gotten this player back in December or January, like we would be feeling really good about it. But the fact that his late arrival cost us a lot, cost us a few games. It made us play in that 3-5-2, which really hurt, and it made us not be at full strength for this CONCACAF Champions Cup tie against Monterrey while he was still, that first leg was his second game with the team. And the second leg was his 4th game with the team. So he doesn't have a lot of chemistry. We talked about him and Julian Gressel don't play well together, at least so far. He didn't get a lot of time with Messi. So it really cost him this Champions Cup game. Like I said, I'm giving it a B. What's your grade?
I'll give it a C+, just because I don't think this is a reflection of the player. It's just overall what this move meant in terms of the timing, how late it was, and what it led to in terms of our structure and our overall team chemistry. So I'm going to give it a C+.
Okay, I have 2 more players to talk about, but only one more official signing, and that is Leo Afonso. On April 2nd, he gets a first-team contract. He came up from a B-team contract twice, had reasonable roles. Inter Miami likes this player. He did really well for the B team in a couple games, and Inter Miami rewarded him with a first-team contract. I question the timing of this decision to sign him. We talked about why we had to sign Israel Boatwright so early, Tyler Hall so early, Santi Morales so early. These players are on our 30-man roster, and they don't impact the first team. Leo Afonso was going to impact the first team. The problem was he fills your 30th spot on the roster, meaning you have no more flexibility. Or if you want flexibility, you have to create it yourself. I don't know that Inter Miami had to sign this player to a first-team contract when they did, considering he still had a few more options, from the B team to sign a one-game loan. And that also he makes it difficult to do anything else for the rest of the window. It's not a question of if this player deserves a first-team contract. I think he does. This also kind of plays into the fact that we talked about this team could really use more wingers and offensive, minded players, and we don't have them. And maybe that's a problem with roster building in and of itself. Talk to me about Leo Afonso.
It seems like at some point Tata realized that there's a lack of depth in our wingers. We need options there. And maybe this is a sign that Matheus Rojas is not happening because they potentially felt like it's too late to try and go out and get someone who's of a higher caliber. And the kind of talent that he's shown, they thought he'd be a good option off the bench when needed. And it's better to get him up into the first team rather than go out and buy another winger. So potentially that's the idea behind it. I'm not sure if they're still going to get Matheus Rojas in. It looks like they probably will. But I feel like there's a bit of again, timing-wise, it's slightly strange because you're tying yourself to a certain inflexibility here. I felt like this one could have waited a little longer if we needed to make this happen.
Yeah, I agree, and that's I think the basis of my grade. He didn't play against Monterrey in the second leg, which shows that Tata Martino still doesn't really trust him in that like I need him now kind of way. And so to me, that tells me there was no reason to put him on a first team contract until April 24th, right? When you know that you don't need that first team roster spot for any reason. What's your grade?
I'll give this a B.
I'm going to give it a C minus just because of the timing. I do think he's a solid player. I think if Robbie Robinson was healthy for the first half of this season, this doesn't happen. His injury, I think, would have changes this whole conversation a lot, because then suddenly we do have a wing player that we can either bring off the bench or give a start to that we feel comfortable with. So Robbie Robinson's injury, I think, shades a lot of this conversation. But again, I think he's earned a first team contract. So still a C minus, but only because of the timing. That's the last roster move. 26 that we talked about. There was a couple we didn't talk about, and maybe we should just hit real quick. We didn't talk about LGP. There was nothing Inter Miami. Inter Miami had no say in this. He was on loan at River Plate. They had an option to buy, and they exercised it. Inter Miami didn't do anything, so there's not really anything to grade. And then Harvey Neville, I just forgot to make a graphic for him, but once Phil Neville left, Javier Morales didn't give him any game time, and Tata Martino didn't give him any game time. He didn't spend any time this winter with the team, so it was just a matter of, can we move this player on for something of value? And it turns out they couldn't. So I don't know if there's really anything to grade there either.
Yeah, it was a matter of when, not if.
Yeah. Okay, finally, it sounds like there might be one player that we might still get. We're not going to grade him because there's nothing to grade yet. But let's talk about Matías Rojas for a minute. We teased him at the beginning of the show. He did show up on the MLS website. That does seem like it indicates that he's going to join the team. They have 6 days to make it happen until next Tuesday. So whatever his deal is with Corinthians, they got to figure that out. To me, I've thought until we saw him on the MLS website, I thought it wasn't going to happen, mostly because he wasn't going to be able to figure out his situation with Corinthians in time. And that, I thought, is why they signed Leo Afonso when they did, because they realized Rojas isn't going to happen. It feels like it might happen now. They would have to make another move to move a player off the roster. We're not going to speculate on what that might be. So without knowing that, it's hard to make a grade here because that would add context. But talk to me about Matías Rojas. Are you excited for this player? You think he's going to have a huge impact? Let's talk about
I think he's going to have a bigger impact than people might think. The fact that he can play a number 10, but also the right wing and left wing, potentially as a forward anywhere on the pitch, might be a really, really good option. I think he might be something we want Gressel to be when Messi's out. Again, I don't want to blow this out of proportion. I'm not sure how he's going to fit in, how well he's going to adapt to the team, what his impact's going to be. But on paper, I'm very excited for him. He adds much needed depth on the wings, and I think he's a lot more dynamic than what we have going forward right now. As of now, we're focused primarily on Robert Taylor as our run-in behind option, as someone who can unlock defenses with his speed. Having Matías Rojas on the other side might add a different dimension to this team. It might allow us to play a little bit of a different formation as well, with Messi and him on the pitch. Could be a potentially game-changing setup. So, and as a bench option, he'd be fantastic. So overall, very excited. Let's see if it comes through or not, but hopefully it does. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, he's a left-footed player, but my understanding is he can play on the right. He's comfortable there. He's not so left-footed that he can only play on the one side. But this team needs options in the wide forward position. Lionel Messi obviously plays there, but he's not an Iron Man in terms of playing 90 minutes every game. Robert Taylor generally stays healthy, but we've seen as soon as he gets hurt, we don't really have a lot of options. Robbie Robinson, He could come back in a week and a half, or he could not play all season, and I have no idea. Neither would surprise me. And then they signed Leo Afonso, who is young, and he's played 100-ish total minutes. So there's no saying what he's going to be. I hate to even make a judgment on a player until we've seen him 10 times. So Afonso, 144 total minutes so far. They need a winger. They need it. And so they're bringing in, sounds like Matías Rojas. And I think he's going to be a really good player. I think from everything I've heard, he's, for this level, going to be a standout player. And I think we're going to get him for relatively cheap too. So I'm excited about him if it happens. Do you want to give an overall grade to Tata Martino and Chris Henderson? Maybe even just some general thoughts on how they did this offseason in this window.
I think there are a couple of really good moves. Overall, I'm a little bit I've been left wanting, because I feel like they filled up certain positions, but then kind of shot themselves in the foot with the timing of a lot of other decisions. And it's left this team vulnerable in the most important places that we need to shore up, which is the defense and which is the defensive midfield position. I think they could have done better in terms of how quickly they could have moved certain players on and how quickly they could have constructed the entire roster. I think they took too long, whether that was on them, whether that was contingent on the fact that we had the Inter Miami tax to deal with. Obviously, a lot of factors to play. But overall, I think on balance, they've done okay. Not fabulous, not too bad. I would say somewhere between a B and a B minus.
I'll be honest. This is still the best roster in MLS history on paper. Probably it's not even really that close. We haven't seen that yet because we've had a lot of injuries. Lionel Messi hasn't played, and it requires Lionel Messi to stand up to that claim. But that doesn't mean it's a perfectly balanced roster. We would love to have gotten another center back. Even if it was Freire and we kept Kamal Miller, I think we would both feel a lot better about that. Kamal Miller and Sergei Kristoff are making about the same amount of money, and they both take up an international roster slot. So maybe there's a way they could have made that change. But really, to me, it's the winger depth and having a star level center back. And I always knew the center back was going to be difficult, but getting another winger probably wouldn't have been. I don't know what Robbie Robinson's injury. I don't know if he had it all off season or if it happened the day before camp, but to me, that kind of changed a lot. Any overarching thoughts before we close this out tonight?
Hopefully this roster lives up to your expectations of the best roster ever created, man, because
so far,
after that CONCACAF disappointment, it's really bummed my mood. And I hope we get Matías Rojas in, because that's really going to change the dimension of how we're going to play going forward. We need a little bit more dynamism. There's certain lethargy in this team that comes into play sometimes, and it's not good to see. So we'll find out how this stacks up to the rest of the MLS, but it's definitely one that can win trophies. That's for sure, if everyone stays healthy.
I want to play a little game real quick. Tell me if this is your best 11 if everyone's healthy, based on the current 30-man roster, and let's add Matías Rojas just for fun. Drake Callender in goal, Tota Aviles and Freire as the center backs, Jordi Alba and Marcelo Weigandt as your fullbacks, a midfield of Busquets, Diego Gomez, and Redondo, Lionel Messi on the right, Robert Taylor on the left, and Luis Suárez up top. Is that your 11?
Yep.
Okay.
That is my 11.
If that's your 11, if everyone's healthy, your bench could be Leo Campana, Matías Rojas, Benjamin Kramaski, Julian Gressel, David Ruiz, Yannick Bright, Franco Negri, Noah Allen, Sergei Kristoff, and Ciro dos Santos. And Ian Frey, I apologize. There's a world where this is not just an excellent starting 11, but every single player on that bench is a high-quality player as well There's depth at every position, or at least most positions, maybe not at right back, but like the reason that we haven't seen that yet is because of the injuries at inopportune times. And if I clipped that 1 minute, that 1 minute reading of the bench and the starting lineup, you could get really excited about it.
But you know what that world's called? It's called FIFA, where you play with the injuries off mode. Unfortunately, we can't turn injuries off in MLS. So that's
I understand.
bound to happen. And that's why you got to create a roster depth that's able to sustain the injuries.
I understand, of course, but then there's always going to be an injury or a yellow card suspension or an international duty or, whatever. But it does on paper. There is a ton of depth. And I do want to give Chris Henderson some credit for building that and keeping everything roster compliant. I guess my final question before we log off is, do you think we're going to see a lot of changes over the summer?
It depends on how we start playing, because there's definitely a lot of disappointment in being knocked out from the CONCACAF and a lot of questions about Tata Martino. So if Tata Martino stays up until the summer and this team starts performing to the caliber that we think it does, then I think there's going to be a couple of changes here and there, maybe one or two big signings. A defender comes in, an attacker comes in, but not too many changes around. But if Tata Martino gets sacked, or if we don't play that well going forward up until the summer, then I can definitely see a few of these players being offloaded, because there are a few question marks that need to be answered.
Yeah, you could definitely see a reshuffling of the center back room. Diego Gomez might be moving on to Europe. So we'll see. But I agree. I think we're going to let the season play out for a little bit before we make any sort of decisions there. Anyways, guys, we've gone for about an hour and 36 minutes, a little bit longer than we wanted to. So we appreciate you all staying with us, and we appreciate you getting in the chat and everything. We'll be back for our pregame show the hour before kickoff. As always, that's going to be Saturday night. We played Nashville. It's our third time playing them already this season. We've done pretty well over the last 5 games. 5 times we've played them, we haven't lost. So we've sort of turned the tide in that rivalry. Any words before we sign off?
No, I think we're going to go on a good run of some games where it's going to be fairly comfortable. Watch me jinx this, but it's going to be fairly comfortable, not too much jeopardy involved. We're not going to be as nervous. So it's going to be a fun time, and I hope the listeners join us and get involved.
All right, guys, we'll see you on Saturday, and we hope you have a great evening.